This episode is for the writer who dips in and out of their writing. You're probably not a full-time writer, and your creative work is more likely to follow bursts of inspiration rather than a steady, consistent writing practice. I have been there. You are a hobby writer, and for a long time, this approach has probably worked for you. But if you're here listening to this podcast episode, you've probably hit a wall of some kind. Call it writer's block or something else, but that inspiration-driven writing isn't working for you anymore. And the reason is simple. You have been a hobby writer, and that is not going to get you a published book. Let's get into it. You are listening to the Memoir Method podcast, the place for writers, readers, and anyone who appreciates the collective power of our stories. In this podcast, we explore the impact of memoir alongside an examination of writing techniques and strategies used in the genre. Whether you are a writer looking for inspiration and guidance or a passionate reader seeking meaningful connections through shared experiences, the Memoir Method podcast is your go-to conversation spot. I'm your host, Charlotte, editor, writer, and the heart behind Charlotte Writes. Let's get started. So I want to start off by talking about how discipline in your writing isn't actually the point. Sometimes when I listen to career writers talk about writing and the importance of consistency and discipline, it's actually easy for me to tune out because it feels surface level. Like, of course, I know I'm supposed to show up to my work, right? But I don't want you to be disciplined for the sake of consistency. And that is where I feel like a lot of writing advice stops. And in this episode, I want to go deeper because yes, consistency matters, but let's talk about why. I want you to be disciplined because the consistency is going to create an environment where your creativity can flow. When you are a hobby writer, someone who kind of stops and starts and treats your writing as something that you get to when it's convenient, there's not a disciplined writing practice there typically, right? And I'm going to go into a couple of ways that this hobby mentality can show up. The inconsistency is one way. When you're disciplined, when you have a consistent writing practice, you create continual conditions where inspiration and ideas can flow and be captured on the page. When inspiration hits, you are ready for it. You know exactly what to do with it. You can capitalize on it. Consistent writing will make you more receptive, more tuned in, more likely to act on an idea when it arrives, instead of letting it die in a notes app or accumulating in a manuscript draft that isn't going to go anywhere. So when you're treating writing like a hobby, first off, you're missing that consistency and that discipline. Another way that hobby writing shows up for people in my spaces is in a lack of creative focus. Maybe you are showing up regularly, but for whatever reason, you are still not creating those conditions for your ideas to coalesce into something that you are excited about, something that makes sense, something that is publishable. So I'm going to give you two examples of this hobby writing, one for each version, that inconsistency and then that lack of focus, and how they have played out for actual clients of mine. Because again, we can talk about consistency, we can talk about discipline, we can talk about focus, but all of those remain concepts that are easy to consume without actually integrating if you don't know the actual reasons behind them. My intention in this episode is to help you understand why the consistency matters and why focus matters, not just as this is something you should do, but actually understanding how that integrates into your writing practice now. So before I dive into these case studies though, I want you to understand just how much this attitude of writing as a hobby is going to cost you as a creative. Again, this isn't about discipline. It's not even about focus. Yes, a discipline and a consistent writing practice does create those conditions for your ideas to flow better. But deeper than that, the more time you spend with your story and your work consistently, the more clearly you will be able to see what you actually need to say with your story. You want to tell the truest version of your story, not just what happened, but you want to go deeper. And you're not going to be able to go deeper if you don't spend time in the story. You can't access that truest version of your story if you don't take your own writing seriously. Writers who engage with their writing the same way that they would a hobby, in spurts, when it's convenient, when they have ideas already, are unlikely to finish the work that they're actually called to be doing. If you're here listening to this episode and you want to write a memoir, then you are meant to write a memoir. I fully believe that. But if you never do it, if you never write it, if you spin around waiting for the right moment or the right conditions, then you will never finish. There will be regrets there. Treating your writing like a hobby means that you are waiting for the right conditions to appear for you to create, instead of creating the right conditions to access your creative flow. And even deeper, hobby writing prevents you from spending enough time with your story to unearth what you are actually meant to say with it. I want this episode to be a bit of a wake-up call because I want you to take your writing seriously because you are meant to, you're supposed to. This is a calling for you. So with writer A, she had been sitting on a memoir idea for years. She technically had a draft, but she would sit down and get about 15 minutes logged of writing before becoming overwhelmed and giving up. Writer A was in my spring cohort of the memoir method. And for years, she had people tell her that she should write about what happened to her. She does have a remarkable story, just even plot-wise. But because she saw her writing as a hobby, instead of as a calling, a vocation, she couldn't understand why anyone would want to read what she had to say. In her time going through the memoir method, she not only spent time with her story on a more consistent basis, she also learned to ask the right questions of herself and her writing. This consistency allowed her to see her writing from a deeper perspective, that consistent, regular time in her story, and that created the conditions for sustained creative flow. Her writing sessions went from 15 minutes to an hour or two every day. This is what happens when you stop hobby writing and take your story and your writing practice seriously. Once she started taking it seriously, she was able to make real progress. Daily writing sessions that lasted 1 or 2 hours. She would put her kids to bed and then go to the computer and write. That didn't used to happen. But when we combined the mental part of the work, taking yourself seriously, and then the work that she was learning in the memoir method to actually see her story in a way that activated the vocation side of writing, activated that, oh, I am actually seeing how this experience can help other people. That's when she unlocked her creative flow. So that was writer A. Writer B would spend a few months working on his manuscript and then let it sit for a few months and then go back to it. And this was off and on for actual years like this. He would end up fiddling with the same scenes and stories, working on individual moments in the manuscript, assuming that those were going to create a cohesive story. A year ago, he hired me for a manuscript evaluation, which is where I read everything that you have written in your manuscript and I give a thorough evaluation. This is not a full developmental edit, but this is a big picture overview, what's working, what's not, what your next steps are. So this is the work that I did for him. And while his line level writing was excellent, I reached the end of those pages and I did not know what the point of his memoir was. He had told me in his onboarding information what he was writing about. Yet when I finished the draft and wrote my editorial letter back to him, I had to confess that I didn't feel the emotional build the way I suspect he wanted me to. This version of hobby writing likely stemmed from something a little different from writer A. Writer A struggled with that deep, consistent work, right? Writer B knew that he wanted to write. He produced tens of thousands of words, but they didn't have a point or a focus. And I know that can sound harsh, but if you haven't heard me say this before, hear me now. Just because something happened to you doesn't mean that someone else is going to care about it. Your job as the author is to excavate your own story for the layer of relevance and meaning underneath it that's going to connect to your writer. Because your memoir isn't about you. It's about them. Hobby writing prevents you from doing that deeper work. It blocks you from thinking about the reader, from considering who was on the other side of the page and why your story is actually important to them. this hobby attitude toward your writing is going to keep your perspective surface level instead of deep and activating to your reader. When I asked writer B what his story was about, the answer changed about 3 times in 1 minute. He had multiple conversations going on. I could see avenues for him to explore each one of them. But the way he was working wasn't enough to help him see how those disparate threads could twine together. And this version of hobby writing is sneaky because on the surface, it looks productive. Yes, he was producing pages, but he was not producing a cohesive manuscript. When he didn't have a clear thesis to tie everything together, more writing could not equate to creative progress. After that manuscript evaluation, he enrolled in the Memoir Method cohort, and we spent 8 weeks dialing in the focus of his story so that he could make the most of his creative time. Now, I'm in the process of giving that brand new revised manuscript a full line edit, something that I refuse to do if it is not in a state where a line edit would be helpful. If he hasn't gone through that deep developmental work offered inside of the Memoir Method program, I am not going to line edit your work. He did a full overhaul on his story. He changed the timeline. He changed the emphasis. He changed the emotional build. And now I'm in the middle of line editing this piece. And again, I would not be able to do my deep work as his editor if he was still treating his writing like an on-again, off-again hobby without the through line tying everything together. In a matter of months, writer B took a manuscript that he'd spent years on that didn't feel cohesive at all, and he turned it into a beautiful story that will connect effortlessly with his readers. And while I'm editing his manuscript, he's looking into literary agents and publishers. So look at what can happen when you take your writing seriously and find the right support to help you move from hobby writer to serious memoirist. So these are 2 very different presentations of the same problem. Writer A avoided the page entirely. Writer B filled pages for years without a through line. Neither lacked ideas, talent, or even effort. What they lacked was the structure that turned sporadic or scattered effort into a finished manuscript. Hobby writing is not always going to look like avoidance. Sometimes it looks like motion without an actual direction. If this episode is landing for you, you might be a hobby writer right now in one of these 2 forms, either avoiding the work because you can't see the point, even though you still feel a pull, or you're working really hard without a focus. So the problem here, again, this is not about your talent, it's not about your ideas, but this is actually entirely about how you have built the conditions for your ideas to take root and grow. I have a few places that you can go after listening to this episode, because again, I want you to leave these episodes with resources to integrate into your writing life right now. First, you could take my memoir kryptonite quiz. This quiz takes 2 minutes. It identifies where you're getting in your own way. The hobby writer is actually a possible answer, so let me know if that's what you get, especially if this episode is one that really resonated with you. Second, you could hop into the Writer's Workshop. This is a workshop series with 3 sessions, all instant access right now. And this is where you will build the structure, the creative foundation to pull you out of the hobby mentality and into taking your writing seriously. We go through how you think, what you consume, and how you work to build a sustainable, adaptable, flexible, creative writing practice for you. And finally, you can hop onto the wait list for the fall cohort of the Memoir Method program. This is the container that both writers A and B went through for writer A to kick off her actual manuscript draft in a way that was fun and sustainable, and for writer B to revise his full manuscript. We are kicking off the final cohort of 2026 in September. I would love to have you in the room. Doors open in August, and people on the wait list get first access to enrollment as well as a discount. So go to the link in the show notes, hop on the wait list, and I will email you in early August for details about how you can join me in September for the fall cohort. As always, my DMs are open. I'd love to hear about your manuscript, where you're feeling blocked, what has and hasn't worked for you in the past, what type of support you are needing as a memoir writer. I love to hear from listeners and find ways to support you where you need it most. Things like the Writer's Workshop and the Memoir Method come from where I've personally felt blocked as a writer, as well as the blocks that I have spent years coaching memoir writers through. This is the work. I'm so glad you're here, and I will see you next week. You've just listened to an episode of the Memoir Method Podcast. The Memoir Method Podcast is presented by Charlotte Writes. If you liked what you heard, the best way to support the show is to subscribe through your preferred podcast player. And if you're feeling especially inspired, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leaving a review really does help other readers and writers like yourself find the show. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on my website at charlottewrites.co or on Instagram at charlottejanewrites. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And remember that you have a story that matters.